The key was cold and heavy in Leo's hand, a tarnished brass thing that felt like a secret. His great aunt Rosalind had left him her apartment in the old Brooklyn brownstone with a single, cryptic instruction in her will. "Look after it all, Leo, especially the quiet things." He'd expected a time capsule of dusty doilies and the faint smell of mothballs. He hadn't expected the silence. It was a profound, layered quiet, thick with the absence of a long life. Afternoons were the worst. The sun would slant through the tall front windows, illuminating galaxies of dust motes dancing over the worn velvet armchair and the grand, silent piano. Leo, a freelance graphic designer whose life was a constant hum of notifications and city noise, found the stillness unnerving. He felt like an intruder in a museum dedicated to a woman he'd barely known. His first project was the bedroom closet, a deep, dark space smelling of cedar and old roses. Behind a rack of faded floral dresses, his fingers brushed against a cardboard shoebox, far heavier than it should be. He pulled it out and lifted the lid. Inside, nestled not in tissue paper but in old, yellowing newsprint, were not shoes but stones. Dozens of them. Smooth, river-worn stones, each about the size of his palm. He picked one up. It was cool and surprisingly comforting to the touch. On its flattest surface, in a delicate, faded script, was painted a single word: Persephone. He reached for another, Orpheus. A third, Atlas. He spilled the entire box onto the faded Persian rug, a mythology of stone: Cassandra, Hermes, Icarus, Penelope. Who were these people? What was this quiet, weighty collection? It felt like the opposite of the vibrant, gossipy aunt he remembered from brief childhood visits, the one who always smelled of gin and oil paint. Driven by a curiosity he couldn't explain, he began a methodical search of the apartment. In a drawer of the massive oak desk, he found her old checkbook. The carbon copies were a history of a modest life: the electric company, the corner grocer, a monthly donation to the Brooklyn Botanic Garden, and then every few months a check written to a H. Finch, always for the same amount, $50. The memo line always read the same: for the keeping. The name meant nothing to him. That evening he typed H. Finch Brooklyn into a search engine. The results were sparse. A few old public records, and one recent article from a local blog dated just a year ago: city's oldest locksmith shop to close its doors. The shop was called Finch and Son Lockworks. The son had predeceased the father, and the father, Harold Finch, was retiring. The address was in Red Hook. The next day, Leo found himself standing before a narrow, grimy storefront squeezed between a welding supply shop and a vacant lot. The painted gold lettering on the window was flaked and peeling, but legible: Finch and Son Lockworks. A bell jingled, a lonely, anachronistic sound, as he stepped inside. The shop was a cave of metal and memory. Keys of every imaginable size and antiquity hung on pegboard walls. The air smelled of cutting oil and old wood. Behind a glass-topped counter filled with intricate lock mechanisms, a very old man with hands like wrinkled parchment was polishing a brass deadbolt. "We're closed," the man said without looking up. "Permanently as of last week." "Mr. Finch?" Leo asked. "My name is Leo Rossi. Rosalind Rossi was my great-aunt." The old man's hands stilled. He looked up and his eyes, a faded blue behind thick glasses, sharpened. "Rosie," he breathed, the word a sigh of long-held memory. "She's gone, then." "A few months ago," Leo said softly. "She left me her apartment. I found some things, a box of stones and her checkbook. She wrote you checks for years. For the keeping," it said. Harold Finch gave a slow, sad nod. He gestured for Leo to wait and disappeared through a beaded curtain into a back room. He returned with a small, brass key, its bow elegantly shaped like a bird in flight. "This is yours now, I suppose," he said, placing it on the counter. "Box 417. "Box?" "The safe deposit boxes are in the vault," Finch said, pointing a gnarled finger towards a heavy, green steel door in the back of the shop. "My father installed them in the 40s for the longshoremen who didn't trust banks. Most of them are empty now, but not Rosie's. Never Rosie." With a reverence that bordered on ceremony, Finch led Leo to the vault. The air inside was cold and still. He inserted a master key, then handed Leo the bird key. "You do the honors." Leo's hand trembled slightly as he turned the key in the lock of box 417. The door swung open with a soft click. Inside was not jewelry or stacks of money, but a single leather-bound journal. He lifted it out. The cover was soft with age. He sat on an old wooden stool right there in the vault, under the dim light and the watchful eye of Harold Finch, and opened it. The first page was a date, September 12, 1946, and below it, in Rosalind's familiar hand, a title, The Dream Atlas. Page after page was filled with her beautiful, looping script, but these were not diary entries. They were stories, vivid, breathtaking stories. A fisherman who fell in love with a mermaid in the Gowanus Canal, a window washer who discovered a kingdom of sparrows on the roof of the Williamsburg Bank building, a love affair conducted entirely through notes left in the hollow of an old oak tree in Prospect Park. Each story was a love letter to Brooklyn that no longer existed, a place of magic and melancholy. And on the page opposite each story, taped carefully in place, was a small, painted stone. The stone named Persephone was for the story of a florist's daughter who could make flowers bloom out of season. Orpheus was for a subway musician whose music could momentarily quiet the roar of the trains. Atlas was for the story of a night watchman who secretly held up the moon over the Brooklyn Bridge. Leo looked up, his eyes wet. She was a writer. She was a dreamer, Finch corrected gently. She told me once that the city was too loud to hear its own dreams, so she listened for it. She'd find a stone that felt like a story, give it a name, and then the story would come to her. She called them her anchors. She said dreams were like kites. They needed a little weight to keep them from blowing away forever. And the checks, Leo asked, for the keeping. Finch smiled, a network of fine lines crinkling around his eyes. For keeping her secrets, for keeping the Atlas safe. She was afraid her family would find it, would think she was foolish. She wanted her dreams to be found by someone who needed to find them. Looks like she got her wish. Leo spent the rest of the day and long into the night in his aunt's quiet apartment, reading. He learned about the hidden lives of bodega cats, the secret language of fire escapes in summer, the ghosts that danced in the reflection of the Coney Island wonder wheel. He saw his aunt not as the eccentric old woman, but as Rosalind, the young artist, the seer of the unseen, the keeper of the city's forgotten soul. The apartment no longer felt silent. It was filled with her voice, with the whispers of 1,000 stories she had pulled from the city's breath. The quiet wasn't an absence anymore, it was a presence. It was the space where dreams could grow. The next morning, Leo went to the bank and withdrew a significant portion of his savings. He walked back to Red Hook and found Harold Finch packing the last of his tools into cardboard boxes. "I want to buy the shop," Leo said, the words tumbling out before he could second-guess them. Finch stared at him. "Son, this place is a relic. There's no business left." "I'm not buying the business," Leo said, his voice firm with a newfound certainty. "I'm buying the vault. I'm buying the boxes." He held up Rosalind's journal. "She spent her life collecting these dreams. Someone has to keep the door open for the next dreamer." He didn't know what he would do with the shop. Maybe he'd turn the front into a studio. But the vault, the safe deposit boxes, he would keep them. He would be the keeper now. He returned to the apartment and took the box of stones from the closet. One by one, he placed them on the windowsills, on the bookshelves, on the mantel above the fireplace. Persephone sat on the piano, Orpheus by the window overlooking the street, Atlas holding a place of honor on his desk. They were no longer a hidden mystery. They were a testament. They were anchors, just as she'd said, holding the dreams fast against the relentless tide of time, ensuring that the quiet, magical heart of Brooklyn would never be completely forgotten.